Good evening, and welcome back to our little campfire gathering. As always, I'm glad you're here. Today, we'll be reading news articles from times past, exploring strange encounters that chill the spine and challenge the imagination. These snippings of black and white print from all over the country, as early as the 1850s, chronicle events unexplained and stand as a testament that that feeling you have on the back of your neck when the sun goes down is something we've always had. So turn out the lights, check that wood line one last time, and make sure to question that thing you saw in the corner of your eye. Our first story comes to us from the year 1880 from the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, Louisiana. A correspondence from the Cleveland Herald follows, based on an inquiry of a supposedly haunted cave and the treasures it's said to contain. Your correspondent, having heard certain rumors of the existence of a haunted cave and a buried treasure in the vicinity of Mount Nebo Station on the Atlantic and Pacific Road about 6 miles from Youngstown, yesterday visited the place in company with several others. Being directed to the gentleman who owns the land on which the haunted cave is situated, the party hied themselves thither. The gentleman, who lives about half a mile south of the station, was found and questioned as to the authenticity of the report concerning the cave. He at first was quite reticent on the subject, but finally, being pressed hard by anxious newsmen, led the way to the cavern, relating on the way the following particulars. Many years ago, when the country was in the vicinity of Mount Nebo but was sparsely settled, 2 men, one a peddler and the other a friend of his, camped one cold winter's night in a cave. The peddler had been to this part of the country before, on a trading expedition, and was returning now to the east on foot, with $13,000, quite an amount of money in those days, that he had realized from his venture. The money he carried in a leathern belt that encircled his waist, and it consisted entirely of gold coin. His companion was well aware of this, and concocted an evil scheme, a plan to rob, and if necessary, murder the peddler. Accordingly, on the night in question, after the peddler had gone to sleep, his friend stole up to him and tried to disengage the belt from around his waist. His efforts awoke the peddler, who immediately on becoming conscious of the presence of the victim, grappled with him. The would-be murderer drew a knife and then plunged it again and again into the body of his victim. Then, securing the money, he buried the corpse in the cave and hid the money on the floor of the cavern 6 feet from the grave of the peddler. Not waiting for daylight, he struck across the country in the direction of Cleveland. The night was bitterly cold and the snow deep and soft. He was unable to proceed very far on the account of a numbness in his feet. He reached a settler's cabin where it was found that both his feet were frozen solid. A surgeon was sent for and amputated both the members. From that day to the day of his death, he was the inmate of various almshouses and the object of private charity. He kept his dreadful secret locked in his own breast and revealed it to no one until on his deathbed in Cleveland, some 20 years ago, when he made his niece his sole confidant. That lady with her husband, who by the way was in rather straitened circumstances, visited Mount Nebo and was able to find the cave by means of certain marks the murderer had left on the trees in its immediate vicinity. But now an almost insurmountable obstacle stood in the way. The cave had fallen in, and some 30 tons of rock rested on the grave of the murdered man and on his buried treasure. Thoroughly disheartened, and without the means of prosecuting the search, the niece and her husband returned to Cleveland. From that time to the present, various efforts have been put forth to unearth the hidden treasure, but all endeavors have proved fruitless. Some years ago, a gentleman who claimed to be a medium visited the spot. He was gone from the house of his host but a short time when he returned with his clothes torn and his face terribly lacerated. According to his statement, he was approaching the cave and was crossing a grassy plot that overlooks it when he felt himself raised with irresistible force and dashed to the rocky bed of the stream. He was impressed that if he stayed and searched for the gold, someone would be killed inside of a few days, so he left. A gentleman from Youngstown, with commendable nerve and courage, visited the cave at the dead of night and was peering into the crevices of the rock when a ghostly, wavering light suddenly appeared, having its source, apparently, under the mass of debris. He left too. A party of gentlemen from Youngstown built a fire near the cave one autumn night with the intention of searching for the gold at midnight, and were warming their hands on one side of the fire when they were startled by seeing a man standing on the opposite side, gazing at them intently. Immediately afterward, he vanished into space. They fled rather precipitately. By the time the narrative was concluded, the party had arrived at the haunted cavern. A pile of rocks and rubbish was all that was left to be seen of the cave. Excavations had been made which extended farther back and through the rock. The host informed the correspondents that he himself had found human bones not far from the cave, which, he had no doubt, once belonged to the murdered peddler. It is a singular fact that the trees surrounding the old cave are in a state of premature decay, presenting much the appearance of having been scourged by fire. The facts above can be authenticated by any of the residents of Mount Nebo. The gentleman who owns the cave desires his name suppressed, solely for the reason that his time is taken up by his daily duties, and he does not wish to be bothered by treasure seekers and the inquiring of news correspondents. Our next article comes to us from the Omaha Daily Bee in Omaha, Nebraska. It is the year 1874. And in it, the story of a Mr. H.P. Stanwood's famed marble cutting shop, where two brothers find themselves awake at the wrong hour and encounter an unlikely visitor from the wrong place and time. It was not long since that report that the house standing at the northwest corner of 13th Street and Capitol Avenue was haunted excited considerable curiosity among the superstitious. This morning, however, we were told a reliable story that puts the haunted house way in the shade. The scene of this strange and true narrative is Prospect Hill Cemetery, adjoining which Mr. H.P. Stanwood, the well-known sculptor, has a small dwelling and marble cutting shop in which several hands are employed. On Tuesday night, shortly after dark, one of the two brothers who sleep in the shop happened to step out of its doors before retiring, and, looking over the silent city, a ghost, a woman in white, the invariable costume of ghosts, met his astonished gaze. The mysterious being was slowly flitting towards the building when he ran in and brought his brother out to view the strange sight. Both became scared, and, hastening out the back door, just as the ghost came in the front door and blew out the light, they ran over to Mr. Stanwood's residence to inform him of what had happened. Mr. Stanwood and the men went out to see what was the matter, and sure enough, they saw before them the ghost, who hit Mr. Stanwood on the back and asked where her children were, and if they were buried in that tomb. The ghost then flitted out of the house, blew out the light, and, entering an upstairs bedroom, so scared the occupant that he jumped out of the window and ran away. One of the two brothers mentioned above, having pulled out his revolver, deliberately took aim and fired twice at the ghost, but without effect. She then took her departure into the cemetery, followed by the men to a certain grave, where she vanished. On Wednesday night, the mysterious ghost again made her appearance, and so frightened the two brothers that they came downtown to sleep during that night and the following night. Mr. Stanwood himself is not a superstitious man and has no faith in ghosts, but our informant assures us that he substantiates the above statement. What a terrible sight to behold on the night shift. It seems that old newspapers have a few things in common when it comes to ladies in white. Here's another from the Chicago Tribune. The year, 1906. The title, Haunted by Dead Mother. Frank Swulius says a spirit disturbs his peace. Because he cursed his mother for a supposed injustice to him previous to her death a year ago, Frank Swulius, 1596 West 39th Street, believes he and his family are haunted by her spirit. When the mother of Swulius died last February, she left most of her property to her daughter. The son thought that he had been treated unjustly, and his anger over the matter caused him to utter violent execrations against the old woman. Shortly afterward, the strange apparitions, accompanied by some uncommon noise, took possession of the Swulius residence. At first, the son and his wife treated the visitations as imaginary and tried to forget the spirit because they did not believe in what are termed ghosts. But as the apparitions increased the number of their visits, Swulius's conscience smote him, and he became convinced that he was haunted because of the unkind words he had spoken against his mother. One night recently, a shadow passed between Swulius and the lamp in his room. He looked up and saw what he declares to be the form of his mother, and his wife, Mrs. Swulius, also saw the apparition. Since then, tables and chairs had been moved to and fro, and the water was turned on and off at the sink when nobody was near. Until 2 weeks ago, Mr. Swulius was night watchman in one of the warehouses of Swift & Co. at the stockyards. But the avenging spirit haunted him there too, so he sought a day position on the killing floor of the Swift plant. "I am convinced that there is more to these apparitions than I first thought," Swulius said last evening. "I know I haven't imagined the things that have happened recently." Mrs. Swulius also corroborated her husband's story. The mother of the haunted man was Mrs. F. Kujawski. She lived with her daughter, Dr. F. Reenstrom, at 1003 West 31st Place. "My mother was always kind to all of us," said Dr. Reenstrom, "and if Frank is followed by a specter, it is because his conscience troubles him. He sees her in his own conscience and believes that he himself is being pursued." So, what do you think of Frank Swulius's encounter with the unknown? Was it really his dead mother haunting him from beyond the grave, or did a burdened mind prey upon his senses? Elusive as the specters we've read about, these questions are incredibly difficult to answer, and it appears the ghastly and unnatural are always out of our reach. But our last article from Boston in 1856 seems to have one particularly haunted house all figured out. It is titled "The Tennessee Ghost." Seeing in a late post notice of the celebrated Cock Lane ghost of London, I am reminded of another ghost of which I have not before thought for years, that made a great noise and created a tremendous excitement at the time. It made its appearance in Robertson County, Tennessee, some 30 years ago or upwards, at the house of an old Mr. Bell. Hence I call it the Tennessee Ghost, or perhaps I had better call it the Bell Ghost, as it seemed to have visited his house on account of a young daughter he had, familiarly called Miss Betsy Bell. It was in the form of a voice speaking in different parts of the house. It generally, as ghosts are wont to do, manifested itself only in the night, and, if I am not mistaken, the lights all had to be put out before it would even speak. It would be heard sometimes in one part of the house, and sometimes in another, moving about from floor, under the floor, and the walls, to the bed, open space in the midst of the house, the roof, and all other places. The ghost would converse freely with persons, and such was the excitement it created that the house was constantly thronged with persons from all parts of the country, coming even 50 miles or more to hear it. When asked how long it was going to remain, it would reply, "Until Joshua Gardner and Betsy Bell get married." Now, Mr. Gardner was a very likely young man who resided in the neighborhood, and with whom the writer of this subsequently became well acquainted. Such was the number of persons who thronged the house night after night that they came near eating old Mr. Bell out of house and home. But the thing could not last always. The spell of enchantment was destined to be broken. It turned out that Miss Betsy Bell was a ventriloquist, had, from some circumstance, become aware of the possession of such powers, and had fallen in love with Mr. Gardner, and wished him to marry her. But Joshua Gardner and Betsy Bell never did marry, and the ghost at length vanished into thin air, as is generally the end of all ghosts. There are numbers now living in Robertson County, Tennessee, and elsewhere, who have heard of this ghost, and are well aware of its unusual circumstances. It looks like that's the end of our time together tonight. As the campfire wanes, I'd like to wish you a good night. It's cold out there, so bundle up and make sure your lantern is close by your side. If you like the video, please consider subscribing. And if you have a story you've been dying to tell, please send me an email to the address provided below. Once again, I'm thankful you're here. So stay spooky until we meet again.